It is better to enlighten men's minds than to teach them to be obstinate in their prejudices. I created this video because my experience has shown me that people most often have only a rudimentary understanding of religion and its relationship to society, and this is particularly true of my religion, Christianity. There's an understanding of this for children, and there's another understanding of religion that's quite different for adults. In this video, I plan to compare the philosophy of Christianity, of anarchism, and communism, otherwise known as progressivism. I most often refer to communism as progressivism in this video, and define the basis, and part of the purpose of this video is to define the basis of these three different systems. I hope to show that while many people consider themselves to be something other than Christians, are in fact Christians in their belief of the basic principles of right and wrong. And this makes them lawful Christians, and religion is really about law. The religion forms the substrate for society because it forms the universals from which courts operate, and society is really a system of laws. And a Christian court is very different than, say, a Islamic court or a Talmudic Jewish court. These have different basic structures, and your rights are very different under these three systems. Western society is being ideologically destroyed, so there's literally a war on reason and conscience, and these are the ideas that Christianity is really all about. The other religions have a lot of statutes and laws, and Christianity is really about reason and conscience, otherwise known as logos. Much of it came from Greek philosophy. Words, ideas, and ideals have been twisted and turned upside down, and the slow destruction of Christianity is really part of the New World Order plan. Planks of the Communist Manifesto, number 27, shows their plan to destroy Christianity. Infiltrate the churches and replace revealed religion with social religion. Discredit the Bible and emphasize the need for intellectual maturity, which does not need a religious crutch. When first coming to realize this conspiracy, I decided to look at it from a rational point of view rather than that of a historicist. I'm naturally inclined that way towards rationalism, and I find that historians in the truth movement are excellent. I watch a lot of their videos. I couldn't add anything of value in that context, but I also think that the truth movement is very short on pure rationalism or pure philosophy, and this is where I intend to make a contribution. My first experience with history was reading a book about the German Holocaust. As an 11-year-old, I had questions regarding how this could happen. No one could give me really a rational explanation other than to say that Hitler was a madman. And nobody could provide me with any real motive for this. And so I came away from that thinking, well, history doesn't really have to make sense to most people. Since YouTube, I've been watching a lot of YouTube videos on historians being interviewed regarding their books, and lots of different historians. I watch a lot of stuff that runs contrary to my own opinion. To really read history, you have to read a lot of different stuff from a lot of different viewpoints, and even that is just a small point in time. You could spend a lifetime, say, trying to figure out what happened between 1810 and 1820. So I've been reading philosophy seriously since about 2001. I wanted to get an understanding of the New World Order from that point of view. So I started with Plato and Aristotle and worked myself up to Kant and some stuff past Kant. Primarily, I'm a Kantian. Most people don't know much about this great philosopher, but he's probably quoted as much as any of the Greeks, any of the ancient Greeks. His philosophy is on the true, the good, and the beautiful, and in the case of the true, that being the nature of truth, the good, that being the subject of ethics, and the beautiful, that being the subject of aesthetics. Now these are his first, second, and third critiques, and each one is taken seriously within its respective discipline. You find art students reading the third critique of judgment. You find ethics people referencing and talking about Kant. And the critique of pure reason, although not often read by science people is often very well respected by the science people who do read it. Kant is an academic philosophy, so it's not the kind of philosophy that's going to tell you what you should do in a specific circumstance. Like, say, Sun Tzu, that Chinese philosopher of war. It's a very different kind of a book. It's a pure academic philosophy, which means it doesn't really talk about particular experiences. In addition to this, I've read some of the seminal works of the Frankfurt School and materialism. I've read some of the German ideology and to get the basic ideas behind Marxism. And I've read monetary reform and government think tank reports pertaining to the successful formation of a world government. One of those reports being the quotation that follows.
Love, ah love, could thou and I with fate conspire to grasp the sorry scheme of things entire? Would not we shatter it to bits and then remold it nearer to the heart's desire?
I'm primarily interested in the philosophy of freedom and wish to demonstrate that freedom is attained only through universal laws in this presentation. It's likely that no philosopher since Plato and Aristotle has been quoted so much as Kant, and Kant was an Enlightenment philosopher in Germany who lived between 1724 and 1804. His first book, The Critique of Pure Reason, on which all of his subsequent works are based, was first published in 1781 with the second edition in 1787. Like Aristotle, Kant's philosophy was extremely wide-ranging, and he's been very, very well quoted in all kinds of fields, not only philosophy, but biology and cosmology and other fields as well. Back then they were natural scientists. Kant took the ideas of Plato and Aristotle and really united them in terms of human perception. So oftentimes people that have only read pre-Kantian philosophy describe themselves as either being Platonists, idealists, or Aristotelians, believing that the world is comprised of matter. The Critique of Pure Reason unites these two and further abstracts and refines this great Greek philosophy. He gets a lot of criticism from progressives, and rightfully so. He's a philosopher of freedom, and this is something that the progressive world very much stands against, at least the Christian understanding of freedom. The progressive understanding of freedom is more of a return to nature. The Christian idea is to rise above nature and have absolute universals.
The nebular hypothesis is the most widely accepted model in the field of cosmology to explain the formation and evolution of the solar system. It suggests that the solar system formed from nebulous material. The theory was developed by Immanuel Kant. With the possible exception of Plato's Republic, The Critique of Pure Reason is the most important philosophical book ever written. Quoting Professor Oliver Johnson, Ian P. McGreal, great thinkers of the Western world.
Kant defined freedom and placed limits on how far reason can take man. He argued that the world cannot possibly exist as we see it, and brings philosophy to a critical crossroads in The Critique of Pure Reason. Kant shows that to believe that the world exists as we see it is as much of a leap of faith as to believe that in a deity. Kant shows, using pure reason, that the world cannot exist as we see it. This is the basis for Kantian philosophy. He said over 200 years ago what theoretical physicists often say today. Kant did not get his recognition by being born into the right family. He grew up Christian and middle class. His rise to fame was based solely on his own abilities. I was partly inspired to create this video from a famous Donald Rumsfeld quote. There are things we know, things we don't know, and things we don't know that we don't know. The subject matter of this video will be about things forgotten, something Rumsfeld didn't include in his quote. It's the things that we have forgotten that is partly responsible for the New World Order way of thinking that we are being led towards. Lots of people create and invent new ideas and post them up on YouTube. This video doesn't have any new ideas. It only covers older ideas and mostly ideas from the philosopher Immanuel Kant, and it is on the subject of freedom. I'm going to provide a rational critique of progressivism and anarchism, and this will be through the lens of rational law. Kant spoke against what we see growing around us, the New World Order, because he thought it was a ridiculous idea in itself. He writes about this in Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, and calls this doctrine chiliasm. And I'm going to be getting into that more later. It is a fundamental violation of his categorical imperative, the ideals and goals of the United Nations. And the categorical imperative is the one thing that most people know Kant for. Most people that go through university read some Kant at one point or another. He doesn't give the New World Order philosophy enough attention to really say a lot about it, but the little he does say about it really speaks volumes. He would have, when the New World Order became sort of known, he would have been deep in his own works around the end of the Critique of Pure Reason and into the second Critique of Practical Reason, and possibly the Critique of Judgment, as well as other books that he's written. Kant is really about the world of is versus ought. So there's a world of materialism, a world governed by cause and effect, and a world governed by free will, the ought. So we think of things how they ought to be in ethical terms, and this is, and so the world is really comprised of sort of an is side, the side that science more or less describes, and the world of ought, the area of morality and ethics, and there's really no mixing the two.
Part 1. Society and Laws. Society will develop a new kind of servitude which covers the surface of society with a network of complicated rules through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people, till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is the shepherd. Alexis de Tocqueville.
The well-known Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau explains in his work The Social Contract that society has two bases from which to exist. One is it provides the members of society safety from barbarians, and the second is that society provides an ease of economic load. Easing economic loads is accomplished through money and markets. With money we can make labor portable. We can go and build a house and take the money that we earn and buy food. I can build houses and use the money I make to buy bread. I don't have to be able to make bread, build houses, build cars, whatever. Society must also bear the burden of protection of both of its citizens and its currencies. Currencies can be counterfeited. You get pirates and so forth, and we really need government protection to protect our currencies as well as ourselves. Money requires laws to exist, and the value of money has to be protected. Commercial routes with land and sea must be protected from pirates. Trade barriers protect the various organs from within a society from being lost or forgotten. If we all of a sudden, or if we are or would have some other society make all our computer processors, then eventually our society here would forget how to make computer processors, and we would therefore be dependent on the countries that are making these processors. And this is part of a will of the New World Order to create more interdependence. And when we're dependent on someone else, we're not as free and we can't rise up against the current realm. Now, the nature of laws are that laws in themselves, the word law implies universality. And laws are required for a free society to exist. And a lot of people think that, if we get rid of all the laws, we'll be free. And that's really far from true. In the city, for instance, we need laws against parking in the middle of the street. So, I mean, if you want to go someplace and there's a car parked in the middle of the street because somebody ran into the store, you've got to stop. That inconveniences you. That's actually a violation of your freedom. And so you need a law to protect that. These different laws vary from society to society. For instance, in Venice, you wouldn't, if all the streets were rivers, you wouldn't have laws regarding parked cars. Nobody would be able to park their boat in the middle of a river and swim over to the store. Plato writes in the Republic of Plato, the nature of statutory law, an important dialogue between Socrates and a member of the ruling class in Book 4 of the Republic. The Republic is a book primarily about justice, and here's the quote.
"Yes, my friend," I said, "provided, that is, a God grants the preservation of the laws we described before. And if not," he said, "they'll spend their lives continually setting down many such rules and correcting them, thinking they'll get a hold of what's best." "You mean," I said, "that such men will live like those who are sick, but due to licentiousness aren't willing to quit their worthless way of life?" "Most certainly. And don't they go on charmingly? For all their treatment they get nowhere, except of course to make their illnesses more complicated and bigger, always hoping that if someone would just recommend a drug they would be, thanks to it, healthy." "Yes," he said, "the affections of men are sick in that way, exactly like that." Part 2. Law. "The letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life." New Testament, 2 Corinthians 3-6. Good law means good order. Aristotle, the Politic. "The magistrate is speaking law, but the law is a silent magistrate." Cicero. "The best laws cannot make a constitution work in spite of morals. Morals can turn the worst laws to advantage. That is a commonplace truth, but one to which my studies are always bringing me back. It is the central point in my conception. I see it at the end of all my reflections." Alexis de Tocqueville.
I want to unpack the concept of law a bit. Law, by its very nature and its very definition, implies universal truth. By definition, law is absolute truth. Kant describes two philosophers as having a conversation with regard to the nature of absolute truth. And he describes one as milking a he-goat, while the other one holds a sieve underneath. This is to illustrate the point that while he-goats don't give milk and there is no absolute truth. So if there's no absolute truth, how is it that we come to know laws? I'm going to describe three different kinds of laws. The first kind, mathematical laws, which are absolute truth, but only exist in our minds. These are synthetic truths. These are truths that are made up in the mind of man. Geometry is based on the shortest distance between 2 points being a straight line, and the arithmetic is based on a perception of time. First you have one, then you have another, then you have another. So there's the concept of counting. And these are space and time are two modes of perception from which the laws of mathematics can be derived. We don't need to actually have any empirical experience to derive the laws of mathematics. Now, mathematics is perfect and ideal within itself, but it can never really describe the real world in concise terms. You can have one basket of apples, you can have another basket of apples, and you can describe both of those baskets by a number. But that number is not fully descriptive of the apples. In one basket, more can be rotten than the next, and so on and so on. So the numerical description and approximations to empirical reality are approximations and not really exact and precise truths. For the physical laws and the sciences, first-year science students are often asked to do an experiment, and this consists of each student getting a little cardboard box that's closed and it contains an object inside, and you perform scientific experiments to determine what the object is inside the box. So through a set of observations you develop a model of what is inside the box. You may conclude that it's a nut and be able to predict the box's behavior in terms of thinking of it as containing a nut inside. And this model may very well work in describing the reality with respect to that box, but still you don't really actually know what's in it. So Science in itself is really based on observation, and this experiment is done to illustrate people the philosophy of science, which is based on the scientific method, which is to make observations, form hypotheses, and then try and disprove those hypotheses. Once you reach a hypothesis that cannot be disproven, then your statement is, your hypothesis becomes a scientific truth or a scientific law.
Science, my boy, is made up of mistakes, but they are mistakes which it is useful to make because they lead little by little to the truth.
The third set of laws are the moral laws, and they are really quite separate from science. Does the world exist as we see it, as science sees it? Can science really ever see what's inside the box? I'm going to give a short Kantian explanation of this in the last section of this video. This is a critical question with regards to how it relates to law. If the world exists as we see it, then we are merely part of a giant chemical reaction governed by the laws of cause and effect, and each subsequent state can be determined from the previous states. There's nothing in the world that happens by chance. What I'm going to do next week is already predetermined. What I'm going to think next week is already predetermined by the structure of the molecules in my brain and chemicals and whatever. Everything can be determined by experience. If there is more to the world than cause and effect, this is free will. And free will is something that we need to describe and explain human experience. And free will gives us the moral laws, and I'm going to get into this more later. And the purpose of moral law is to maximize that freedom, to infringe as little as possible on the freedom of will of others. So for instance, parking your car in the middle of the street to run into the store gets in the way of everybody else who happen to be driving along the same road and want to go somewhere. So we need a law to maintain that freedom. Moral laws are absolute, written, universal truths, and they come from priests and philosophers deducing the word of God. The existence of free will is the proof of the existence of God. We assume that God created us because he wanted to see us happy. So theology is really all about formulating these universal moral laws so that we can create happy societies. And the existence of a God is required to generate the precepts from which to create universal laws and from which to base a society on. Conscience is known as the hard problem and has three basic characteristics. One, a conscious being has self-awareness. Two, a conscious being is aware of the knowledge of moral laws, rational reasoning required to maximize free will. And three, all thinking is framed in causality and purpose, and this is the last part of Kant's third critique of judgment. So this is not really a widely stated thing with regard to consciousness, because Kant really isn't in the progressive world academic picture anymore.
Why are we here? Why do we exist? Where does this question come from?
The components of consciousness are independent of space and time and therefore quite separate from the physical world defined by the laws of science. The laws that protect freedom are true for all time and in all places. They don't have an empirical or a scientific component. Universals cannot have ambiguous terms such as happiness or well-being. So if we're going to create laws around, let's say, maximizing the well-being, well, what's well-being or happiness? Those are ambiguous terms, and you can't write laws with ambiguous terms because those terms can change meaning.
When the multitude heard this, they were astonished at his doctrine. But when the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him, and saying, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Matthew 22-36.
There are three well-known law books in the West, the Christian Bible, the Jewish Talmud, and the Islamic Quran. Of course, there is Hinduism and Zoroaster, but we're not really conscious of those religions. The Quran and the Bible are small and relatively compact books when compared to the Jewish Talmud. The Jewish Talmud is about an oral tradition passed down through generations of rabbis and consists of somewhere between 20 and 30 volumes depending on the translation. The Christian Bible is the shortest of them all, the New Testament, and it's a law based on reason itself. It's a basic reason, and consciousness is what really defines Christianity. It contains two basic maxims that are really the same. In the Bible and in life we have two different kinds of laws. We refer to water as the law of man necessary for society and commerce, and the wine is the absolute space and time independent moral laws given from God. Now, in society, lawyers necessarily mix water with wine in their business. The Bible does warn us of those who mix water with wine, and also shows that this is sometimes necessary. In the case of holy matrimony, you also have a civil side to that. So when we have the laws of marriage, we necessarily mix water with wine. Western society evolved along with English jurisprudence, and it is based on Christian law. Man's law, commercial law, as in the Old Testament, probably has its roots in the experiences of ancient merchants and bankers, and these are laws pertaining to bankruptcy and for instance, bankruptcy for an individual is 7 years, for a country is 70 years is the limitation, and so forth. These ideas come from the Bible. The Bible forms the basis of law in Western society. It's interesting to note that the attacks on 9/11 and the subsequent police state that's been developing around us occurred along the same time that we were supposed to have a jubilee. We had a bankruptcy in 1933, and we should have had a jubilee from that in 2003, but instead we had a police state that was well along its way to being fully developed. Some 9/11 conspiracy researchers think that the 9/11 was taken to scare everybody out of voting for the Jubilee and eliminating the debt. And this to me seems like a credible explanation. There's always the real reason and the ostensible reason, but I'm going to get into explaining why that is so later in this presentation. English jurisprudence evolved from the Christianity, and an important concept of this is the Holy Trinity. Kant explains the Holy Trinity as consisting of the Father as the lawgiver, the Son as forgiveness, and the Holy Ghost being consciousness. Christian courts manifest the Trinity in their operation, so you have an accuser, a defense attorney, and the jury, which is to act as the conscience of the court. So what the jury does is make sure that the imperfect man-made laws don't end up unfairly punishing somebody, because no law can be perfect. Somebody could be charged with murder, but that murder could be justified, and that really is up to a jury to decide. Whereas in the case with absolute truth, absolute hard laws, there is no jury, there is no conscious interpretation as to what's going on. You are subject to the machinations of law. Jury nullification makes the jury the final adjudicator, and juries can question the guilt or innocence of the accused based on the evidence, the efficacy of the law itself as applied to the accused in the particular circumstances. Juries are not comprised of lawyers, and therefore do not judge from the letter of the law, but from the spirit of the law, and they have the ultimate say. In modern courts, they're actually administrators in Soviet administrative courts, having the appearance of judges in a world characterized by the inverted logic of progressivism. Lysander Spooner, in Trial by Jury, had this to say about juries.
It is manifest, therefore, that the jury must judge of and try the whole case, and every part and parcel of the case, free of any dictation or authority on the part of the government. They must judge of the existence of the law, of the true exposition of the law, of the justice of the law, and of the admissibility and weight of all the evidence offered. Otherwise, the government will have everything its own way. The jury will be mere puppets in the hands of the government, and the trial will be, in reality, a trial by government, and not a trial by country. In such trials, the government determine its own powers over the people instead of the people's determining their own liberties against the government. And it will be an entire delusion to talk, as for centuries we have done, of the trial by jury as a palladium of liberty, or as any protection to the people against the oppression and tyranny of the government. Lysander Spooner.
Kant explains that courts of jurisprudence have been traditionally based on both fact and right in the critique of pure reason. John may have robbed Bob and it may be provable, but Peter has no right to prosecute. This goes to right, who has the right to prosecute. The basic requirement of fact has been dismissed in Canadian courts. There's a famous quote that fact is no defense in a Canadian court. This inversion of logic has been necessary for the persecution of historical researchers such as Ernst Zundel, as well as many others in countries in the Western world where historicists question the reality of the Holocaust and perhaps other things. This makes the law subjective rather than objective and universal, and it becomes subject to those who administer it, so it's no longer universal. People can now be prosecuted for hate crimes in courts where feelings rise above facts. And, this is a progressive illusion that's slowly overtaking our consciousness and inverting reason. Hurt feelings can override facts in progressive courts. It's reason and not feelings that gives us knowledge of right and wrong. Adults learn to govern themselves by reason, and children govern themselves by emotion. Statutory laws, combined with the philosophy of the ancient Chinese philosopher, legal, along with the Pharisees, has been leading us to a world that now surrounds us. Legal is not synonymous with law and can sometimes be its diametric opposite. So what's legal is not necessarily what's lawful. The ancient Chinese society based on legalism with its bureaucrats was overthrown by Confucius. Legalism hides rational law behind a shroud of complex and living laws to bend the rules in favor of the ruling classes, who can afford attorneys and often think that they're getting lawyers. Legal attorneys are fundamentally different from lawyers. An attorney is a wealth transfer agent, and a lawyer is one well studied at law. Now, our courts are based on money, so you get charged with a crime. In other words, they want money, and then you hire an attorney, and the case proceeds from there. I'm going to get into a little bit more about judgments in the section on money.
The first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. Shakespeare, King Henry.
Many Christians believe that the concept of eating from the tree of knowledge means learning about the nature of good and evil, and that it's forbidden. And so they therefore tend to leave this determination to authorities. To eat from the tree of knowledge, good and evil, is to use the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law in your dealings. So if you're eating from the tree of knowledge, you know of both the man-made laws and the spiritual laws. So let's say somebody legally owes you money, but they really shouldn't have to pay you. You follow the letter of the law when you make them pay you anyway, and the spirit of the law when you do not. So the letter and the spirit of the law is based on consciousness. Laws cannot be perfect, and therefore we need conscience to determine whether a particular law actually applies in a particular circumstance. And conscience comes from free will. But progressivism is taking over Christian law in the courts, and progressivism has no absolutes or universal laws, and nothing is sacred. All laws come in the form of statutory laws, actually unending statutory laws. Attorneys, though, must necessarily eat from the tree of knowledge to preserve our corrupt monetary system. And I'm going to explain more about the lawfulness of our monetary system and how it works in the next section on money. The corrupted nature of our money is the principal cause of the violations of freedom that we experience around us. It's the increased debt means an increased police state, an increased ability for the banks to collect on this national debt. So under law, a debtor actually has no rights. And so this is the world we see growing up around us with this police state checkpoints and so forth. It's really because we owe a lot of money, according to the government and the bankers and the attorneys. The next section follows on money, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about the basis for that.
I can see the day coming when even your home garden is going to be against the law. Bob Dylan, Union Sundown. Part 3. Money. No, not rich. I'm a poor man with money, which is not the same thing. Gabriel Garcia Marquez. To an imagination of any scope, the most far-reaching form of power is not money, it is the command of ideas. Oliver Wendell Holmes, The Path of the Law.
The value of money can be based on two fundamental ideas. One is that the money alone has a physical value, such as in the case with gold and silver. And the other one is that it's based on a promise. So the gold and silver sort of belongs to the is side of things. You actually have that wealth. Whereas the money that's based on a promissory note is actually based on a promise. Somebody ought to perform an action when you present them with this money, although it has no substantive value in itself. Promissory notes were first created to transport wealth over long distances. If you were a merchant and you wanted to transport money across the ocean, then you could get promissory notes from your bank where you are and then cash those in for gold and silver at your destination. And this means that if your ship is lost, all that gold and silver isn't lost. The law of promissory notes is also known as the law of the sea, under two categories. At peace, it is the law merchant, and at war, it's called admiralty law. The most basic kind of promissory note is this. Suppose you're at a poker game and the chips are down and Bob's out of money. To make the next round of bets, he drops an IOU into the stack. Now everybody knows that Bob is good for the money, and whoever wins the money simply presents Bob with an IOU at a later date. The IOU gets destroyed and the money gets paid. It's the paper that carries the promise. This sort of thing happens with banking clearinghouses all the time. IOUs are commercial paper such as checks, electronic transfers, and other instruments. The commercial paper includes things like court judgments, stocks, bonds, checks, and other forms of lawful promises. It's all based on rational logic, and this is the law of water, the law of the sea, and the law of man. The tradition known as the law merchant has evolved into what's now known as the Uniform Commercial Code. Suppose Bob took John to court and exercised a claim against him. Suppose John had backed into his shed and damaged it, causing Bob to experience a financial loss. He could take John to court, and if the judgment was in Bob's favor, he'd have commercial paper in the form of a judgment, and that judgment allows him to exercise certain lawful rights in collecting money that he is owed to make him whole again. He might have to hire a sheriff or something or take something of John's until he receives his money. The judgment is just a piece of paper promising John that he has lawful means to collect the debt. Now, that's the nature of promissory notes. Now, before going any further with this, I want to talk about the nature of fractional reserve banking. It's often said that fractional reserve banking creates wealth from thin air. This really isn't strictly true, and it's not really possible. I think it was just a remark that somebody made as a joke, and it got carried on to reality. Promises do exist in reality, and these are promissory notes that we're passing around. Under fractional reserve banking, a bank operates with a reserve ratio. And for the purposes of the following example, we'll assume that the reserve ratio is 10%. This means that if I deposit money into a bank, the bank has to keep 10% of what I deposit and they can lend out the remaining 90%. Does not mean that they can create wealth from thin air, as the following will illustrate. If I deposit $100, the bank may lend out $90 and must hold on to $10 as a reserve. Even if the bank has lent out $90 of my money, I can still walk in and take back my full deposit. If everyone does this, there's a run on the banks. If few people do this, everything works fine. That $90 inevitably gets deposited in a bank. It could be received as a payment from the one who borrowed it. It sits in a bank account somewhere, of which 10% is held. The rest, $81, gets lent out again. The pattern continues and continues until the banks have nearly $1,000 lent out on that $100 I deposited. The bank is paying interest on the savings accounts of $1,000 because it is holding all that money in accounts. It maintains the promise to all of the depositors, and that way the money is created from promise and responsibility on the part of the bank. Fractional reserve banking has the effect of lowering interest rates. If the bank actually had to have the money that it lent you, interest rates would be around 30%. There'd be no upward mobility in the classes, and one could not borrow money to start a business or change his material well-being or improve his material well-being in society. Interest rates of 30% create stationary classes with little or no upward mobility within a society. Whether or not money should be lent at interest is another topic. I'm talking about what is and not necessarily what should be. Christian law states that usury is a sin. And Michael Hoffman explains usury in a video called Michael Hoffman Talks About Usury on YouTube. It's about 20 minutes long and it's a really good video. Usury may be at the root of our problems, and Hoffman makes an excellent case for this in the 20-minute presentation. This particular instance of usury, which I describe above, is not central to the corruption of the monetary system that's turned our elected representatives into whores. In the case of consumer side banking, the private side, fractional reserve banking is good for the economy, whether you agree with it ethically or not. It adds value to the consumer society. The money being passed around while backed by a promise from the bank does have a substantive value, the labor that backs it up. If people stop working for it, it would become worthless. The money has a value in that it represents actual labor. Now, so far I've been talking about private money, the money which is exchanged between individuals and companies and contracts working in the economy. The law that governs this money is known as commutative law because it is contracting between individual entities. Now I want to talk about public money, the methods which government finances itself in a country. This creates laws for which all are subject, and this is known as distributive law. The following quote explains the basic nature of government financing. The Federal Reserve banks are one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever seen. There is not a man within the sound of my voice who does not know that this nation is run by international bankers. Louis T. McFadden. Some people think the Federal Reserve banks are United States government institutions. They are not government institutions. They are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of the United States for the benefit of themselves and their foreign swindlers. Again, Louis T. McFadden, Congressional Record. Now I'll explain the nature of public money. That is, the finance of governments. It's a fundamentally different nature than private money because it is created from a different promise. Governments do not create money directly. They create it with the central banks. The banks do not work with the governments work with the banks. The actual creation of money takes place using a process someone once called glad-handing. The glad-handing well has an unlimited depth. Governments create bonds and sell them to the bank. The bond itself is based on a promise that both sides of the glad-handing scheme know cannot be kept, as both know that even the existing debt cannot be repaid. The promise of the bond gives the money value and is ultimately dependent on labor actually earning the money and paying the taxes in the future. That's you and I. It presupposes that we are locked into debt slavery. Kant remarked on personality, debt slavery, and bondsmen in the following. No one can bind himself to this kind of dependence by which he ceases to be a person by contract, since it is only as a person that he can make that contract.
Later in the text he adds, "Nor can a bondsman offspring be claimed as bondsman because he has given rise to the expense of being educated. For parents have an absolute duty to educate their children, and when the parents are in bondage, their masters take over this duty along with the possession of their subjects." And that's Kant, Metaphysics of Morals. The private banks don't provide any value to governments in lending them money other than managing monetary policy and the money supply for their own interests. The CIA, FBI, armies, constables, and everyone that carries a gun essentially works for the banks. The president has jurisdiction in domestic policy only. Wars are being fought for the expansion of the financial institutions. Violence is ultimately the promise from which the banks can create money to finance governments. FBI and National Academy of Sciences have both said that private gun ownership does not really increase crime rates. This causes one to stop and ask, why all this effort toward private gun ownership regulation and confiscation? Banks establish monetary policy quite separate from governments and operate in their own interest. Privately owned central banks have their hand on the trigger of a gun pointing at the economy. They can collapse the economy by changing the interest rates. It's up to them what the interest rates will be. Alan Greenspan has a famous YouTube video explaining the relationship of banks to the governments that is not really included in this video. So the governments really serve two masters, the banks and the people. They've got to keep two masters happy, and one cannot really serve two masters. The banks, in exchange for this privilege, always allow the politicians to borrow as much money as they want, keeping them out of the banking business. War and war machinery, government projects, a socialist state, all financed with borrowed money, allow the politicians to keep both masters happy. Under the current system of monetary creation in countries with central banks and fiat currency, every dollar in circulation is collecting interest for some bank. All money within the central bank economies have all their currency based on usury, that is, collecting interest. It requires continuous expansion of the economy just to meet the interest payments on the growing debt. So your taxes are really collected to pay the interest on the growing debt. They don't actually go towards running the society. And the debt really isn't real because it's based on a promise that cannot be kept. If all the loans were called in, there'd be no money left, and still some would be owing. James Traficant speaks on the record in the following quote. "Mr. Speaker, we are here now in Chapter 11. Members of Congress are official trustees presiding over the greatest reorganization of any bankrupt entity in world history, the U.S. government. We are setting forth, hopefully, a blueprint for our future. There's some who say it's a coroner's report that will lead to our demise." James Traficant, Congressional Record. Under the current central bank model, money enters the economy by three basic routes. Governments borrow it, corporations and companies borrow it, and people borrow it. For a dollar to exist in the economy, it must be a borrowed dollar. Every dollar in circulation is collecting interest for a bank somewhere. And the total debt always exceeds the money supply available. War has become the industry that keeps the economies expanding, borrowing, and spending to make interest payments on the debt. Countries around the world have been encouraged to convert to Western democracy, meaning the Western central banking model. If encouragement doesn't work, there are other ways. John Perkins, an ex-world banker, describes them in his famous book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. He has done some YouTube video interviews that are quite informative. Perkins explains that the armed forces are the repo men for countries that do not tax their people enough to pay their debt to the IMF and World Banks. U.S. armed forces currently occupy over 150 countries around the world. I think it's maybe closer to 200. Countries that have not adopted the central banking scheme are the ones listed as enemies and terrorists in corporate media. This is how and why democracy is being spread throughout the world. Democracy means Western democracy. Central banks, along with secret brotherhoods, ultimately leading to progressivism, Bolshevism. Kant speaks on the topic of secret societies in the following quote. "The third right also belongs to the state for its preservation, that of inspection, so that no association of political or religious fanatics that could affect the well-being of society remains concealed." Kant, Metaphysics of Morals. The money created by glad-handing
has its value reinforced by the courts at home and by guns abroad. But Leviathan always comes home. Banks that finance government keep track of this debt, which is much larger than the current supply, because they intend to collect on it. Fines are levied for breaking statutes that start life as bills. Charges are laid, also as another way of collecting money, although the mechanics of how the court collects its money when it charges somebody, I do not know. It's kind of secretive, I guess. More statutes bring more money to pay more interest on government loans. Phony environmentalism and other fears license governments to write more laws and statutes to keep us safe. When government serves two masters, there's always the ostensible reason and the real reason. Expansion of government services helps keep the dream alive, and real wealth generated by actual labor producing useful goods is being exported to slavers. So real wealth now is being produced in China. They make our electronics. They're going to be making a lot more things. They're going to be the manufacturing center of the world, it looks like. So real wealth is actually generated by production. As we lose our productive capabilities to China, we lose control of our economic future. And this is really partly what the New World Order is about, making everybody more interdependent and thus less able to control their own future. Tocqueville comments on the nature of government financing and elections in the following quote:
"The American Republic will endure until the day Congress discovers that it can bribe the public with the public's money."
Law backs up money, and money backs up law. They are one and the same. Courts that reinforce the value of a monetary system cannot be said to be any better than the monetary system itself. On the private side, legitimate debt does exist. People borrow money to buy things. The problem is that governments finance themselves with private central banks which offer no value to the money. The politicians cannot legitimately promise that it can be paid back, only that they will continue to expand the economy and implement banker think tank policies, non-government organization policies, and bills so that the interest on the loans can continue to be paid. The following quote illustrates the power that banks have over government.
"Let me issue and control a nation's currency, and I care not who writes the laws."
So there's not really a lot that cannot be fixed. We do have an existing society that is essentially based on freedom, Christian law, and governments could create and simply spend money into the economy. Kennedy wanted to print off US notes, and like other presidents that endorsed similar sentiments, he was assassinated. But countries are really governed by political will, so there needs to be a political will for this fundamental change to take place if it is going to take place. Government money allows management of economic downturns. They can be mitigated by government projects, so the government could manage the monetary supply in a productive way. If there was a depression, then they could simply build more infrastructure by spending currency into the economy. If a bridge needed to be built, the money simply gets printed, and the builders of the bridge spread asset money throughout the economy. The money that they have is money that they actually did work for, so it has a real value. In this case, not every dollar bears the burden of interest. Not every dollar would be rented from banks, and taxation would be a method of inflation control. And that's partly the purpose of taxation now, is to manage the money supply within the economy, so the bankers print it off and give it to their friends, and then you pay it back. Governments would not serve two masters if governments created and spent their own money into the economy. Tax burdens would be substantially reduced, the price of goods and services would be reduced, and people would not live in economic fear. Honest money could bring a renaissance that we can't really even imagine. Imagine if you only had to work 20 or 30 hours a week to support yourself in comfort and not have to build up assets and not have economic fear. This would lead to a new freedom that I think the powers that be would be afraid of. But people are really being distracted from these essential truths with the conspiracy theories that are really pure fiction. Things like aliens are going to attack us, and there's free energy, and there's a giant conspiracy to hide the fact that we can have free energy. The Earth is flat. New planets are entering our solar system. And I think really these ideas are being planted in the alternative truth movement by the CIA or other intelligence agencies. People talking about free energy really don't know anything about science, and People that are talking about the Earth is flat, they don't know anything about physics, and whether or not a new planet is entering our solar system is something that we determine from what we see on the video, and anything can be created on the video, and that goes for alien sightings and so forth as well. I mean, if they can make Hollywood movies that look like flying saucers are flying around, they can do the same thing in real life and put these videos out through the truth movements and alternative truth movements. So really, there's a lot of noise out there to distract us from the essential truth. Actually, two essential truths is that one, we desperately need monetary reform, and two, we won't achieve monetary reform unless there's a great political will to achieve this.
Part 4. Good and Evil. Well then, demonstrate before the palaces of the rich. Demand work. They do not give you work, demand bread. They deny you both, take bread. Emma Goldman. Most assuredly I say unto you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs up some other way, is the same as a thief and a robber. King James Version, John 10:1. This is a reference to false teachings.
Now, I want to unpack the concept of God a little bit. I should have maybe done this earlier in the presentation. Political belief is formed by how one conceives the concept of God. In a very basic sense, an individual carries one of three kinds of beliefs with respect to the existence of God. One, nature is God. Man created society to get away from nature with the knowledge and experience to know that Mother Nature is a cruel and unforgiving bitch. Living by the laws of nature is the opposite of living free. We are not only at war with nature, its food supply, and its weather, but against one another without laws under anarchism as savages.
The masses, more often than not, have seen the anarchist for what he is, an arrogant, albeit sensitive snob, and they have rewarded him accordingly.
Anarchism can only work in small groups, where everyone knows one another and there's no need for money and therefore no need for laws. Under pure anarchy, you own what you can carry and defend. In a small group, everybody knows each other, you don't have to worry about your stuff getting stolen, or whatever. If anarchy was ever achieved on a wide scale, there would be the need for laws. And you'd get exactly the opposite of anarchy. You'd have lawyers and attorneys and legislators tripping all over courtrooms and houses of legislation trying to determine what's best, just like in that Plato quote that I gave earlier. And what a complex system like that does is allow the powers that be to help their friends and harm their enemies. This is one view of justice presented in Plato's Republic. This is an oligarchical view of justice. 2. Man is God. There is no God, and the best and most capable of men should lead humanity. This is sometimes known as humanism, it's progressivism, it's communism, it's essentially organized atheism. The thing that I particularly like about having the ideological enemy of progressivism is that its basic ideology sounds so good and logical at first, but their premises always fall flat on their faces with even the smallest of a push. Only one absolute truth exists in progressivism. Progressivism always falls on its face, even with the most cursory examination. Progressivism has only empty platitudes, empty slogans, and illogical precepts from which to lead the masses. Its precept is fundamentally wrong from the start. Alix de Tocqueville had this prediction for where America was headed in the following quote.
Society will develop a new kind of servitude which covers the surface of society with a network of complicated rules through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people, till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrial animals of which the government is the shepherd.
Now this has to happen to an extent if we are to have a technological society. And Jacques Ellul, a famous French sociologist, wrote a book called The Technological Society that explains this. There has to be a certain amount of organization as well as pre-planning in order to build a device like a computer or a smartphone or a car. because the initial investment is so huge. And if we want to be efficient and not be completely wasteful, we want to produce the right number of cars and cell phones and so forth. So there has to be planning, there has to be knowledge and collection of data so that people can make predictions. There's a basic objection to the idea of progressivism, and it's a very good one. What is best? What is just? This is the subject of Plato's Republic. It's not exactly a settled matter. It's a hard question like consciousness itself. But the basic Platonic objection to progressivism is that the most capable of us not only have the capacity to do great, but also have the greatest capacity to do evil. Now, we can take a look at progressivism and see where it's been leading us since 1913. We've had all kinds of wars. We currently occupy over 150 countries. Its fruit is houses of legislation that have been converted to whorehouses. It's wars, pestilence, disease. It's a law that has its operating principles hidden in sophistry, licentiousness, and intimidation. It creates a class of noble, honorable, and distinguished rulers who permit themselves to operate above the law in the name of progress. Madeleine Albright, when interviewed by a corporatist on mainstream media, had the following answer to the question of the sacrifice of 500,000 Iraqi children.
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it. Madeleine Albright, when asked about the sacrifice of 500,000 Iraqi children in the hunt for Iraqi WMDs.
Progressives always blame those who make society better by making them a better car or making them a better pair of shoes as the source of all their problems, when really the capitalism simply means that the business owner, the person who runs the business, owns the means of production. Problems that we face are really due to the monetary system itself, not capitalists, not somebody who wants to build a factory and build a better pair of shoes. That's a good thing. 3, the belief in God.
Liberty cannot be established without morality, nor morality without faith. Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America.
To believe in God is to believe there are absolutes in law. God is the lawgiver. Earthly philosophers deduce the word of God, the philosophy that everyone should follow to have safe and productive societies. Laws are the instrument of freedom and allow man to rise above nature, to expand horizons beyond simple need and want. God's laws prevent people from making themselves God, and they place all men under known universals, which is really the only kind of true law. The concept of God is an evolution of man's consciousness to obtain greater freedom. That freedom is threatened by a cruel and unforgiving bitch on one side, and the mother of all evil, statutory regulation without universals. The devil only operates by statutory laws because he cannot operate by universals. Most people, maybe even everyone, is extremely satisfied with the governments in the West. They don't seem to be operating in our interest. We grew up in an environment that created the belief that somehow our houses of parliament and Congress were churches of virtue, courage, wisdom, and prudence. We didn't say it that way, but when we take government's word in an unquestioning way, these are in fact our beliefs. Things may have always been this way, and the government may have always been operating against our best interests in secret. That's usually the case with governments. Without this internet awakening, most of us would not know what we know today. The knee-jerk reactions that we need more and bigger governments, and even a bigger government will be less corrupt and less wasteful and less warmongering than the current big government that we have. This seems to be what progressives demand, with more regulations and more laws. Environmentalism is a vehicle for that. More protection, more statutes, and more debt. On the other side of the fence, we have the anarchists who want no government. It's anarchism that our governments pretend to be afraid of. The nature of governance and law is undergoing a basic inversion, and the following David Spangler quote illustrates this inversion.
No one will enter the New Age unless he will take a Luciferian initiation.
In truth, our governments fear a re-emergence of Christian consciousness and knowledge of the law, and the necessity of universals. Christians are being persecuted in places all throughout the world that you're not hearing about on the news, because the powers that be in implementing this New World Order feel very threatened by Christian law. The New World Order cannot stand under Christian law. Christian law-based societies are being diluted and destroyed through multiculturalism, debt, wars, and other progressive ideals. Multiculturalism is not about equality or human rights. Governments that support multiculturalism are bombing these countries that these people have to come here. For every action of those who serve two masters, there's the profane reason and then there's the real reason. The machine that we have is currently broken, but that's no reason to think that it needs to be torn down. In reality, we just need to restore Christian law, and to do that we need monetary reform. There's no reason why our governments and politicians need to be prostitutes. Personally, when I ran for federal election, I heard remarks that you didn't look like a real party, you didn't have enough signs. Well, I had a very clear and logical platform: simply vote no to everything. And I should have gotten all the votes. It would be an inconvenience to start voting for monetary reform parties. It would certainly send a message. It can interfere with the comfort and convenience that surrounds us. It would clean the whores out of the whorehouse. It would set us on a path towards monetary reform in a house of only one master. Good people would go into politics. Good and honest people don't want to serve two masters.
The few who understand the system will be either so interested in its profits or be so dependent upon its favors that there will be no opposition from that class. While on the other hand, the great body of people mentally incapable of comprehending the tremendous advantage that capital derives from the system will bear its burdens without complaints, and perhaps without even suspecting the system is inimical to their interests. Rothschild Brothers of London.
Most of the problem is that most people simply don't know anything about the law. To truly understand the nature of our public monetary system is to see that it isn't lawful. No laws would have to be broken to abolish it altogether. The moral strength of the law is likely a major factor why Christian economies grew to the extent that they did. It creates a people that can contract effectively with one another. Almost all the great places in the world either are or were Christian-based societies. Christian-based societies generate terrific wealth and material well-being. The Christian law itself represents an evolution of religion. Societies based on Christianity and its ideals are built into the courts and governments in the form of the Holy Trinity. It shaped a society that was strong, free, and ethical, and that it did things because it believed them to be right. The voting public at least had this expectation and voted along these lines. People went to World War II because they thought it was necessary. People fought World War I, and people that are fighting all the wars today believe that they're necessary. Christianity is not a statutory or heavily ecclesiastic type of religion. It's more closely related to anarchy, but much more carefully considered. It has a few statutory requirements, other than Sunday being a day of rest. One does not engage in man's law on Sunday. Sunday being a day of rest is not a requirement of God. It's something that man does for man. Kant says that Christianity approaches his ideal of a religion. That is, that it's based on virtue rather than statutory requirements. It's a religion of consciousness. It should not be confused with its institutions and their statutory requirements.
My yoke is easy and my burden light.
The Apostle Paul speaks on the Greeks in the following quote.
Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious. Acts 17-22.
There's a force that lies within the power structure that wishes our current form of law to be undermined. The basic requirement of fact and right are being destroyed. The idea is to convert our governments into one underworld government that adopts what is known as the Jewish Noahide laws as a replacement for all these warring religions that will result from multiculturalism. Noahide law is in no way compatible with Christian law. If there's one thing that I can get you to look at after watching this video, it's to look up information on Noahide laws, the education days of Congress and Parliament around the world, and the Chabad Lubavitcher movement. Chabad is spelt with a CH. Everyone should know about Noahide laws. If I told you about them here, you just wouldn't believe me. All wars are holy wars, and we all supposedly have the same God, but we fight over statutory requirements. This is true, although motivation for fighting a war is money, according to Plato. People really only kill each other for moral or ethical reasons. Kings go to war, bankers make the profits, and soldiers fight for what they believe is right.
Truth is the first casualty of war.
Christians have been fighting a lot of wars. Christian Zionists seem to always want wars. They want whatever Israel wants and they have the resources to get it. They vote. Zionism isn't Christian testament. There's no requirement for Christians to lie down their lives for Jews, although Jews do in fact believe otherwise to the extent that they follow their Babylonian Talmud, just as we are Christians to the extent that we follow our book, the New Testament. Zionism isn't Christianity, it's a new Christianity. It's reinterpreted for the birth of Zionism. Zionism isn't Judaism. Christ once said to judge a tree by its fruit. This is another tree entirely. At home, I think younger people tend to associate Christianity with Zionism and someone trying to coax giraffes onto an ark. They do not wish to be associated with it due to its association with Zionism and its superstitions. It's been discredited among the minds of many. And this is mainly because it's being interpreted in a materialistic sense, and it should be interpreted in terms of ought rather than is. It's a book of laws. It's not a science book, it's not a history book, it's a book of laws. In many cases told as parables, as in the case in the New Testament anyway. Compare the length of the New Testament with that of the Babylonian Talmud, occupying upwards of 30 volumes of statutory laws passed down by rabbis in an oral tradition. Consider our growing statutory government and consider the Noahide laws. The world of the future will have two sets of laws, Talmudic statutes for members of the Jewish faith and Noahide laws for those who serve them. The world will be adjudicated by the Talmudic Sanhedrin priesthood in Israel, who say that when Moses wrote the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, they stuck around after everybody else left, received additional laws, and became the chosen people of God.
And the original Zionist slogan, "A land without a people for a people without a land," disclosed its own negation when I saw the densely populated Arab towns dwelling sullenly under Jewish tutelage. Christopher Hitchens.
Jews are led by statutory regulation and fear due to Holocaustianity. Imagine if you lived in a closed community where you thought that everyone on the outside wants to set you on fire and use your skin to make lampshades. Holocaustianity is a state-protected religion because it can't really stand up to rational inquiry, which is why it's being protected from it. It is now fear and excessive statutory regulation that is shaping the world around Christian societies.
Part 5. Progressivism. This movement among the Jews is not new. From the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx and down to Trotsky, Russia, Bela Kun, Hungary, Rosa Luxemburg, Germany, and Emma Goldman, United States, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstruction of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence, and impossible equality has been steadily growing. Winston Churchill, Zionism versus Bolshevism, Illustrated Sunday Herald, 8 February 1920. A government that was also legislative would have to be called despotic as opposed to a patriotic government. But by a patriotic government, it is understood to not be a paternalistic one, which is the most despotic of all, since it treats its citizens as children, but one serving the native land.
In Christian societies, theologians and judges wear the black robe. This symbolizes the death of law itself, meaning that it's unchanging and settled, unlike living statutory law, which is always changing to fix itself, like that Plato quote I gave earlier. Progressivism is really defined by change. directed improvements by our betters, the creation of statutory laws that place the hopes, dreams, and aspirations of a small ruling class above those of everyone else. This philosophy was the philosophy of the Bolsheviks. Progressivism is the idea that there is no God and that man can and should be led by his betters. It places the rule of state above rational laws of man through statutory law. It is in direct ideological opposition to any religion that has a God above men. Rulers become the gods, and their statutory law is always expanding due to the licentiousness. Again, that quote, that Platonic quote that I gave at the very beginning. It's a world described by progressive Marx now and has been desired by the Pharisees. Man's behavior is entirely determined by his economics and his surroundings. There is no God other than the God of need and want, and those who regulate for those needs become gods. Progressivism is really a return to nature. So we do certain things because of nature. We eat because of nature. We go to the bathroom. We have sex because of nature. And progressivism is really giving up our virtue over to nature. It's an idea led by equality, where some are more equal than others, and the law is created from momentary needs rather than to reflect the absolute truth. It's a belief that this will lead to a kinder and gentler world that defines progressivism at its core. In a progressive world, there's no truth. The desire for moral action is purely subjective. Therefore, the adjudication of these actions is also subjective. Now, Kant argues that while a desire for moral behavior may in itself be subjective, its adjudication is definitely objective. There are objective laws that reflect absolute truth if we wish to live in a practical, moral world comprised of beings with free will. Like any institution in society, it must have a basis of law to exist. The following biblical quote in Proverbs 22-7 shows the lawful basis for progressivism.
The rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender.
Progressivism, at its lawful core, is the collection of debt through the creation of statutory law. Statutory laws are born in the form of bills presented to Congress. Laws are created with the aid of banker think tanks and non-government organizations. A lot of these people cannot be audited. No one can really look in their doors and see what they're up to. More laws and more protection are demanded by progressive dupes in riots and demonstrations. These groups are often financed by oligarchs such as George Soros. Bolshevism is a Jewish idea, and it was implemented by the Jewish engineers of society in early 20th century Russia. It's based on statutory law, just as its Talmud is based on statutory law. The Talmud occupies around 30 volumes. I think that the New World Order is Talmudic in structure as well as in its goals. And there's an excellent YouTube movie called The Real Face of the European Union that really shows the nature of how the world is going to be run. And they do not explicitly state that it's Talmudic law, but there's a lot of darkness in this setup. Christian law is a light load based on conscience itself. It's written only in a few hundred pages. According to the Talmud itself is above the rule of God. God himself consults the Talmud, and Jesus Christ is boiling an excrement for the remainder of eternity. The Talmud cannot stand under a law of conscience. Christianity has to be destroyed. Ideas like multiculturalism, anti-hate laws, egalitarianism, and collectivization invert reality. These are Bolshevik ideals and were the ideas that formed the basis of the Russian Revolution in the early 20th century. These ideas require an inversion of reality to gain political acceptance, and propaganda is used to invert reality. Progressive doctrine led to the Russian Bolsheviks' murder of upwards of 60 million Christians during the Bolshevik Revolution. There's a carefully planned and managed and protected Holocaust truth that we're never to forget, and the Bolshevik Holocaust we're never to remember. We forget if Christians kill Jews, but never remember when Jews kill Christians. Alexander Solzhenitsyn remarks on the Bolshevik Holocaust in the following quote.
It is unthinkable in the 20th century to fail to distinguish between what constitutes an abominable atrocity that must be prosecuted and what constitutes that past which ought not to be stirred up. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, The Gulag Archipelago.
I want to take a look at some of the core arguments and absolute truths adopted by progressives. 1. Multiculturalism. Almost everywhere, except the State of Israel, multiculturalism is being implemented in the West. Muslims may freely enter the United States and bring their culture and beliefs with them. The profane reason is that men will come to understand one another, making a more peaceful world. The real reason is the dilution and the destruction of Christianity.
Europe is not going to be that monolithic society they once were in the last century. Jews are going to be at the center of that. Barbara Lerner-Specter, from a YouTube video entitled Barbara Lerner-Specter Calls for the Destruction of Christian European Ethnic Societies.
Muslim law is different than Christian law, and it's based on rule by imam and statutes rather than rule by conscience. They do not have juries in Muslim law. Men live in peace when they share a common law. Muslims will dilute Christianity with their presence. Out of chaos comes order, a motto of Jewish Freemasonry. Men will need a new common law to bring peace, and the Jewish Noahide law, written for non-Jews, will bring us that peace. There will be two sets of laws, one for Jews and one for everyone else. If there's one thing I can get you to look at after watching this video, it's the Noahide Laws, Education Day, and the Chabad-Lubavitcher movement. This is the main political and monetary power behind the promotion of Noahide laws.
102nd Congress of the United States of America at the first session, resolved by the Senate and the House Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled that March 26, 1991, the start of the 90th year of Rebbe Menachem Schneerson, leader of the worldwide Lubavitcher movement, is designated as Education Day USA. The President is requested to issue a proclamation calling upon the people of the United States to observe such a day with appropriate ceremonies and activities.
2. Anti-hate laws. Anti-hate laws were first created by the Bolsheviks to prevent anti-Semitism. Ideas presented to us by mainstream media history cannot withstand critical examination, and their truth must be protected by the state. The laws of those who do not follow our laws must be protected. The French philosopher Voltaire is often quoted as saying,
"To learn who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticize."
It's an idea that stands on its own and really doesn't require the endorsement of an authority figure. 3. Egalitarianism. Egalitarianism is the idea that all men are equal. The Christian version of this is that all men stand equal before the law. Although the idea is not explicitly stated in the above form, the Bible is a book of laws, and is always speaking with reference to laws. Its precision requires that each passage be numbered. Kant explained in the following quote,
By what kind and what amount of punishment is that public justice makes its principle and measure? None other than the principle of equality in the position of the needle on the scale of justice. Kant, Metaphysics of Morals.
The concept of equality has changed into something undefinable and subjective under progressivism. If all men are equal, they're equally deserving. Therefore, some must be robbed for the purposes of equalization. The lawlessness of robbery can be deduced from the lawlessness of murder. One expends lifeblood to earn wealth. The taking of it is akin to murder and a violation of the holy law. Now, this doesn't mean that people like me aren't in favor of supporting the poor and having a class that doesn't work. With honest money, we'd be able to have a class of 10 or 20% of the people that just, if they didn't want to work, you didn't have to. And I'm not against that. There's other things you can do outside of work. If egalitarianism is a fundamental truth, then it should be easy to find two men who are actually equal. 4. Collectivization. Collectivization is the Stalinistic term used. The more modern term is collectivism. If we all became more interdependent, there's less of a likelihood of war. Interdependence is a weakness, a psychological illness. We all become more interdependent, become less independent, weaker, and easier to rule. Rockefeller said in his biography,
Some even believe we, the Rockefeller family, are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it. David Rockefeller from Memoirs.
5. Man is bad for the planet. This creates a lifeboat scenario led by scientists. It's been widely discredited on scientific grounds and evidential grounds. Its representatives have been caught lying and manipulating data. On moral grounds, it's diabolical. It gives license for the creation of maxims of evil for the progressives to make. It's the best illustration of the character of the overall agenda. The failure of global warming will require the world to be united under a new threat, and this will be an alien invasion, according to the report from Iron Mountain, a leaked 1960s think tank report. Now, lately in the last month or two, I've been hearing all this stuff about aliens, and it's, there really aren't any green men flying around in flying saucers. It's Hollywood.
Part 6. Philosophy of Progressivism. We shall become aware of the great societies we call states, and directly in contradiction to official policy yet never abandoned. Principles which no philosopher has yet been able to bring into agreement with morality, or else, what is terrible, suggest how to replace with better ones, reconcilable with human nature. So philosophical chiliasm, which hopes for a state of perpetual peace based on a federation of nations united in a world republic, is universally derided as sheer fantasy, as much as theological chiliasm, which awaits the completed moral perfection of the human race. Kant, religion within the boundaries of mere reason. There's a sucker born every minute. P.T. Barnum. It is by the promise of an occult sense of power that evil often attracts the weak. Eric Hoffer, The Viking Book of Aphorisms.
Progressivism seeks to undermine absolute truth in ethics and morals with some famous philosophical problems. The trolley car problem places you at a railway switch. The trolley car is headed down the tracks and the switch is in a position where it will direct the trolley car into a group of 4 people that are on the tracks. If you flip the switch, the trolley car will go down another section of tracks where there is only 1 person. Flipping the switch enables you to save 4 people at the expense of 1. Should you flip the switch? Well, the utilitarian believes that morality and ethics should be shaped around the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Utilitarian would flip the switch. A utilitarian would write endless statutory laws in a constant attempt to fix what's wrong, in the name of justice, to create the greatest happiness for the greatest number, forgetting that happiness and justice need to be defined. The utilitarian continuously swims around in water, getting tired, never finds a dock from which to attach beliefs. It's a license for endless statutory law. The lifeboat problem is another famous problem used by progressives to undermine the notion of absolute law. In this problem, 4 people are on a lifeboat that will sink if it carries any more than 3. 1 must be thrown overboard. The problem lies outside the idea of a society, and therefore outside of laws and morals, ideas that presuppose society. In nature, there is only a constant state of war, and this is what you would have in the lifeboat scenario. The lifeboat scenario is a real problem, according to progressives. It gives them license over and above the laws of God. The world is overpopulated and something must be done. Almost everyone believes the world is overpopulated, an idea that's been hypnotically repeated for many years. This belief cannot be based on knowledge or experience. It is nothing more than a faith in authority.
Fear must rule in a despotism.
Personally, I've flown in an airplane and I've looked out its windows while flying over heavily populated areas like New York City. Anyone who's had this experience cannot argue that man is ruining the planet or that the world's overpopulated unless they've watched far too much television. There's more life in a square inch of a big city than there is in the most dense of rainforests. Foliage grows better around big cities. Carbon dioxide is a life-giving gas. If we didn't pump oil out of the ground, it'd be coming out by itself in the form of tar pits in all kinds of random and terrible locations. Man's irrigation puts water on the possibility of life where Mother Nature will not. Man is actually good for this planet. We could terraform all kinds of areas that are desolate now if, we weren't fighting all these wars. If the world was truly overpopulated and our rulers truly wanted to fix the problem, economies would not be destroyed, which creates poverty. The impoverished produce more. Governments could terraform land here rather than talk about doing it on Mars, if they've ever actually been to Mars. Progressivism is well known not to work, and this is why it's being adopted. It's being adopted to destroy the existing society so that the phoenix will return, the Messiah will make an appearance, and that men will live happily ever after in a morally perfected society. It's philosophical and religious chiasm. Its purpose is to burn down the existing house and force all humanity to run to the new house of the Jewish Noahide laws, to place the rule of man into the hands of the Talmudic Sanhedrin priesthood of Israel, who consider their Talmud to be above the Word of God. There's a world of statutory laws where Jews and non-Jews are judged differently, and that all men are not equal before the law. There'll be no juries or defense lawyers under Noahide rule. Noahide law cannot be subject to universals because people will be the chosen ones, and then there will be everyone else. So it's not a law that's universal.
Extermination of the Christians is a necessary sacrifice. Zohar Shemoth.
Jews are disproportionately represented in all power structures in Western country. They have a disproportionate share of the wealth and are behind multiculturalism in the West. Israel has closed its borders, but the banker-controlled governments in all Western societies seek multiculturalism. Jews are protected by Holocaustianity. To imagine what a world run by Jews might look like, one could compare Western countries with Palestine now and extrapolate to a world where Jews openly rule everywhere. They are God's chosen people, and in reality, all of humanity is their property. We can also look at the Bolshevik Revolution, which is entirely a Jewish revolution and not a Russian revolution.
A Jew should and must make a false oath when the Goyim asks if our books contain anything against them.
Talmudic quotes such as this are numerous, and they can be found all over the web, as well as on General Moore's site, M-O-H-R. English versions of the Talmud can be downloaded. Many Christians have researched the Talmud to inform us, but you will not see this on corporate media. Supporters of the Noahide movement will deny its opposition to Christianity and espouse a peaceful nature due to its seemingly universal set of laws. I haven't discussed the Noahide laws in this video. This is because you wouldn't believe me, and many people really aren't ready to escape their safe zones and look into this.
Part 7. Propaganda is to a democracy what the bludgeon is to a totalitarian state. Noam Chomsky.
The well-known Enlightenment philosopher John Stuart Mills is famous for his philosophy of utilitarianism. He's also famous for a tract on free speech called Liberty. The post-Enlightenment philosophers William James and John Dewey created pragmatism and utilitarianism. Pragmatism and utilitarianism form a bridgework to modern progressivism. That bridge started with the pure materialist and atheist Karl Marx. The philosophy of Marx is based on economics. It's sort of based on the is world rather than the ought side of things. The defining idea of Marxism is that consciousness itself is formed by material reality. Morals and ethics arise only within a society and are fluid product of that society, and therefore there are no universals. Ideas surrounding free will are necessarily opposed to this idea. The Frankfurt School is an intellectual school of modern progressivism. It originated in Germany until Hitler kicked them out, and then they came to America. Prior to World War II, live sex shows, brothels, drugs, and every kind of moral decay plagued Germany as it does America today.
The Fabian Society, founded in 1884, is a British socialist organization whose purpose is to advance the principles of democratic socialism via gradualist and reformist effort in democracies, rather than revolutionary overthrow. Wikipedia. And the Fabian Society logo is a wolf in sheep's clothing, as pictured.
The Enlightenment itself is often blamed for the position that we find ourselves in. It's often confusing elucidations with respect to freedom. But not all philosophers were progressives. Kant was often misunderstood, much more often than he's understood, and I think a lot of the time deliberately. None have been quoted so much since the early Greeks. Almost all modern philosophy references his works. Kant believed that the world we see around us is due to our own perception, not only in sense perception, but ontological and epistemological perception as well. And his hypothesis is that men see the world in the same way but cannot see it as it truly is. The Critique of Pure Reason is a proof of this, as well as a warning of adopting the notion of pure materialism, that is that the world exists as we see it. Now, this led a lot of people to believe that because the physical world itself is subjective in a sense, in sort of the highest sense of truth, the moral world must be a product of our own perceptions as well. The Kantian dialectic is that no absolute truth can be found in the physical world that surrounds us. On the other hand, morality and ethics is both time and space independent, non-empirical, a priori, and based on deduction. A priori means without experience and necessary. So we can rationally deduce that these laws are necessary if free will is to be preserved without making any empirical observation.
Kant's categorical imperative, first formulation. Act only according to that maxim where you can at the same time will that it should become universal law without contradiction. Second formulation. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as means to an end, but always as at the same time an end. Third formulation. Therefore, every rational being must so act as if he were through his maxim always a legislating member in the universal kingdom of ends. Compare that to, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself.
It's no surprise, really, that mainly progressives are studied in undergraduate philosophy and political science, with Kant only given really a cursory examination. Kant is exceptionally difficult, and that may be part of a reason. But the main reason is likely that Kantian philosophy is a philosophy of freedom and speaks against materialism in a really deep and fundamental way. Kant was a Christian, the enemy of progressives. The people that print the money control all aspects of society. Education in various forms, the media, the government, the universities, technological development, wars by funding both sides, and all other organs that depend on the sick and dying currency that provides them with the energy from which to operate. They are Marxists. The family-owned banks that finance the Bolshevik Revolution are the same ones that finance the Western society today. They are not interested in universal laws, such as those deduced by Kant or Christ or anyone. I've already shown the inversion of logic that must take place to implement progressivism, and this is only made possible with propaganda. Jacques Ellul, a famous French sociologist, explains that the well-educated and the well-placed tend to be more subjective to propaganda simply because they believe themselves not to be so easily fooled. It's flat out incredible how people can be manipulated. If you've ever gone to a live hypnotist, picks people out of the audience and can make you think you just shit your pants while you're sitting at a bus stop. And it's incredible to see, and you think of, okay, well, that's what that guy can do in 10 minutes. What can the Pentagon and mainstream media do? The effects of propaganda just really cannot be underestimated.
Crows pick out the eyes of the dead when the dead have no longer need of them, but flatterers mar the soul of the living, and her eyes they blind. Epictetus Fragments. It is too difficult to think nobly when one thinks only of earning a living. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Confessions.
People who tend toward professions assimilate better to modern society and therefore tend to question less. Their lives tend to be stable and they therefore suffer from a normalcy bias and cannot imagine too much beyond their comfortable boxes. Younger ones filled with vanity often believe themselves to be superior and therefore beneficiaries of the corruption that surrounds us. Flattery is always a tool to be used against the vain to enhance their usefulness.
Vanity is my favorite sin, Satan, devil's advocate. I have never seen more senators express discontent with their jobs. I think the major cause is that deep down in our hearts we have been accomplices in doing something terrible and unforgivable to our wonderful country. Deep down in our heart we know that we have given our children a legacy of bankruptcy. We have defrauded our country to get ourselves elected. John Danforth.
John McMurtry, a philosopher from the Canadian University of Guelph, explains that cognitive dissonance prevents people from seeing a truth that is so far different from their norm. He's done work on what is known as the ruling group mind. Forced vaccinations, water fluoridization, false flag terror, wars, feminism, phony environmentalism, feminization of men, egalitarianism, multiculturalism, and all the other things that seem to invert reason are merely symptoms of progressivism. Progressivism is a monster created by the financial powers. Progressivism assaults the mind and inverts its natural ability to reason. Reason, the thing that allows us to discern good and evil, must be inverted for the progress that we see everywhere. Empty slogans such as, in the following quote,
Support the troops. Yes, we can.
These slogans use what's referred to as virtue words and are otherwise completely meaningless. Other virtue words include freedom, truth, liberty, and democracy. They create an emotional response which clouds reason and judgment. The use of virtue words gets the simple-minded into a state of emotion and to vote for bigger governments who promise to protect them with additional statutes. They intend to protect people by increasing taxes, increasing regulations on the most productive and the industrious members of society. Progressives have been mind-warped into blaming the productive part of society for all their troubles since the days of Jewish Rothschild finance Karl Marx. And it's a matter of fact that Marx was financed by the Rothschilds. Back then their name was Bauer. I mean, Marx says that himself in the German ideology.
The few who understand the system will either be so interested in its profits or so dependent on its favor that there will be no opposition from that class. Rothschild brothers, give me control of a nation's money and I care not who makes its laws.
The Jewish psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud has an explanation for the existence of conspiracy theorists. According to Freud, conspiracy theorists are dissatisfied with their lives and seek to externalize the evil they feel within. This is a popular reason, but it's far from reasonable. The Jewish Kabbalah has a different take on it. The Kabbalah says that the pain is often a path to enlightenment. Many conspiracy theorists become that way from experiencing or witnessing the arrogance and corruption of the system up close and personal by being victims of it. The problem becomes very concrete and close rather than distant and abstracted. It's difficult to imagine how the world really works if your worldview is formed by what you see on TV shows and hear from mainstream media pundits. To most people, the corruption is abstracted and not a part. It's a part of reality that other people experience.
This is the secret of propaganda, to totally saturate the person whom the propaganda wants to lay hold of with the ideas of the propaganda without him even noticing that he is being saturated. Paul Watzlawick, Austrian psychologist.
Many well-educated people have been hypnotized to believe that the world is and should be operating from a lifeboat ethic because of overpopulation. They endorse the corruption around us because they believe it to be necessary and they think they'll be able to escape it. Plato states that everyone over the age of 10 years old would have to be killed to reshape a society in the Republic. There are probably many people in the established order of things that believe they are privy to the truth about where progress is leading us. They cannot imagine that they too have been lied to, but with different lies more suitable to work on them, primarily lies based on vanity. We live in a sea of bullshit, and it's primarily responsible for the thoughts and beliefs of the people around us. Asking someone about propaganda is like asking a fish about water. Jacques Ellul explains in Propaganda, the shaping of men's attitudes, that it would be foolish to assume that one is immune to it. He also explains that small doses of truth are a powerful antidote and to the false beliefs performed by or created by propaganda. No one can claim to be the free author of their own beliefs. We believe things that both meet the requirements of our own reason and fall within our own experience. I started reading Kant because his philosophy was highly regarded by the people in my family, by some professors and friends. I know that there are libraries that are filled with books I've never heard of. Unlike a few hundred years ago, one can't really explore all the ideas. Edward Bernays writes in his book Propaganda in the following quote:
"The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as smoothly functioning society. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct, or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by a relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind." Edward Bernays.
Propaganda is ubiquitous, and only a fool can say that he's unaffected by it. The same people that control the propaganda control the money, and therefore rule over us in both mind and body. We're therefore means to another's end and nothing more. We are enslaved by propaganda, rather than men on street corners pointing machine guns at us.
Part 8. Matter versus Spirit. Men could not abandon their religious faith without some kind of aberration of intellect and a sort of violent distortion of their true nature. They are invincibly brought back to more pious sentiments. Unbelief is an accident, and faith is the only permanent state of mankind. Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America.
The matter versus spirit debate is something that's always existed. Is it fate or is it free will that rules the world? It shapes society because it determines the fundamental nature of its law. It's an incredibly important debate, and the societal belief in this debate affects your everyday existence and experiences. Men behave differently when led by other men than they do when being led by universal laws. Established powers are very interested in creating a belief in materialism. And this is manifested in pushing evolution. Now, I don't know what's true. I don't know if evolution is true or not. I don't know if creation is true or not. It doesn't really concern me because the Bible's a law book. It's not a science book. But this push for evolution, there's more to it than just a straightforward belief that it's in fact scientific. It's also a political agenda. And children in school are being taught what to think as opposed to how to think. If they were being taught how to think, they would be taught how to think and be able to make up their mind on this issue on their own. In the case of evolution, the universe and life simply emerged. In the case of the creation, these were created by God. Now, evolution requires a pretty big leap in faith. Essentially, time and space began somewhere. This goes beyond the limits of human perception, and you might as well be debating about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. They're both out of human experience, and we can't apply our cognitive reasons to things that lie outside of our own experience. To me, it seems that the universe or the world was more than likely created by God, if I'm to compare it to things simply emerging. I mean, when you trace the evolution back, it's a matter of things just emerging. It requires a huge leap of faith. The moment we make a statement that starts with a long, long time ago, we leave the domain of experience. Experience is required to validate scientific theories. Evolution cannot be validated with experience, only natural selection can. Birds that have longer beaks reproduce more than others when worms are deep inside the earth. This is natural selection, it's not evolution, and intuitively it's true. Evolution requires the simple to change into the complex, independent of intelligent guidance. It seems to violate the scientific law known as the second law of thermodynamics. This law simply states that things naturally move from an organized state to a disorganized state in a closed system. Things fall apart unless acted upon by outside influence. If you don't paint your fence, it'll eventually rot away into the dirt. It is a perfect example of the second law of thermodynamics at work. Your fence will not evolve into a gazebo.
A theory is more impressive the greater the simplicity of its premises, the more different kinds of things it relates, and the more extended its area of applicability. Therefore, the deep impression that classical thermodynamics made upon me, it is the only physical theory of universal content which I am convinced will never be overthrown than the framework of applicability of its basic concepts. Albert Einstein.
If there is only matter, then men can only create statutory laws to govern society. There are no absolutes. If there is spirit, there is free will. If there is free will, there are definite right and wrongs that all men must adopt universals. The scientific faith of evolution can in no way explain free will. Statutory laws must operate within the limits set forth by universals in a society of individuals that have free will and wish to preserve that free will. Universal laws are necessarily written to maximize freedom for all. To be free, everyone must be free, and laws protect us from others as well as them from us. Materialistic rulers view justice in a very different way than men who are ruled. Even rulers who wish to rule by God's laws have a perspective that is different from the common man. Rulers have an easier job when they are not forced to operate by universals. The rule can simply be considered as a means to an end. Common men are more free when society operates by universals. Free men don't make ideal slaves. He who has the gold rules is the ideal maxim from which rulers prefer to operate from. It is them that has the gold. Ordinary men prefer the golden rule that states the necessity of operating by universals. Treat others as you would want to be treated. The Kantian categorical imperative is better, but most men operate well with the golden rule in this form. Kant's categorical imperative states that we should operate as though our actions should become universals. And that's the final formulation, the third formulation. Rules are motivated to shape public perception of reality as pure materialism. Science rules and there are no absolutes. Men can and should be led by their betters. And this is the fundamental danger of materialism, that men will be led by their so-called betters. There are many YouTube videos as well as mainstream media debates on the subject of matter versus spirit. This is an issue that will never entirely disappear in the public consciousness. Many people simply have a faith in science and in scientists as people who always speak the truth. Scientists are the infallible new gods because science is about truth. Therefore, scientists never lie.
We live in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology, in which hardly anyone knows anything about science and technology. Carl Sagan.
Progressivism can blind us by adopting illogical precepts that cannot be defined, such as equality, good, and happiness. The precepts of progressivism cannot be said to be true because they cannot be defined. Progressives trick us by using virtue words to make false precepts sound good, by having a positive emotional response and therefore an appearance of truth. We all feel good about truth. Debates can be framed to have a predetermined outcome. Progressives often employ a method known as the Delphi technique to shape the outcome of public debates regarding public policy. In the matter versus spirit debate, the debate is always framed with the assumption that science is or will lead us to absolute truth. Progressives attack the ecclesiastical component of religion, its history, and subject it to the requirements dictated by scientific logic. They attempt to disprove key aspects of ecclesiastical faith to undermine faith and therefore the notion of absolute truth, bringing faith into the world of materialism. But science does not meet the requirements of absolute truth. Science presupposes that a faith in science is somehow scientific. Those that push the materialistic view of the world have told a lot of lies and faked a lot of evidence for evolution. This line of reasoning that requires great leaps of faith, such as Big Bang theory, which assume that space and time have a beginning, previous to which neither existed. Everything simply emerged. Science cannot answer the question of consciousness, nor explain the origins of consciousness. It fails miserably when judged from a position of spirit.
You're right in speaking of the moral foundations of science, but you cannot turn around and speak of the scientific foundations of morality. Albert Einstein.
Science is laws that relate cause to effect, and they are written from observations. Science gives us the tools for engineering, and its laws accurately predict material future. A mechanical machine will always obey the laws of Newton. An electrical machine will always obey the laws discovered by Oliver Heaviside and simplified and abstracted by Maxwell. Maxwell's equations are the bedrock of science, according to a famous theoretical physicist, Leonard Susskind. What if this bedrock had a big crack in it? One that's rarely seen in empirical experience, but shows the laws of electricity to possibly be self-contradictory in the sense of absolute truth. In this case, science could not be said to be absolute truth. There is a crack in the bedrock of science, as we understand it. The crack is not well known, and it's best known as the two-capacitor paradox. The understanding of this paradox only requires the use of elementary high school math, and I'm not going to show it here. The two-capacitor paradox shows that in an absolute truth sense of things, that either energy or matter can be destroyed and must be destroyed in certain instances of Maxwell's equations. Circuits that can never be realized in practice, but nonetheless we're talking about absolute truth. Maxwell's equations work in practice, but the question is, are they absolute truth? And if there's an internal contradiction within those equations that is outside of experience, they still cannot be said to espouse absolute truth, only to explain observations. This problem really is simple, and it doesn't have the glamour or the advanced math required to understand it. It doesn't make good television. It doesn't require experts to explain. It also gets resolved every few years by different academics, and then their proofs turn out they get debunked. And this has been going on for 200 years. The matter versus spirit debate should not be framed with the assumption of science being an absolute truth, or by a faith that science will eventually lead us to absolute truth. Science is based on cause and effect, and free will is not. It's like putting water in a gas tank and expecting to be able to drive your car away. It's completely unrelated. What happens when science is required to meet the requirements of spirit? It cannot and must simply say that spirit cannot exist according to the laws of science. It's in your head, it's in your imagination. Science is no closer to explaining consciousness today than it was 3,000 years ago. The scientific solution to the problem is to state that there is no material evidence to support the notion of consciousness. Well, that's kind of the point. There is no scientific evidence to support the notion of something that we all know exists. One adopts one position or another based purely on faith. Kant's critique of pure reason shows that due to limitations in human reason itself, the problem can never be resolved. To believe in a deity or not is purely an act of faith. Practical reason, however, does lead us to believe in a deity, an absolute truth. And this is the subject of Kant's second critique, the critique of practical reason. This absolute truth must be written to carry the lawful strength of the phrase,
"It is written."
Merchant and money laws written in the Bible still hold today. And there's a reason behind these laws, but they could become fluid without the strength of the written word. The boat could be untied from the dock and paddled anywhere. It must be tied simply so that law does not result in a series of knots. Progressives want to untie the boat and have man's betters paddle to a place that promises a kinder, gentler world of equality and to a world of moral perfection. It is the critical crossroads that Kant writes about in the Critique of Pure Reason. Adopting the pure materialistic view of reality will not cause material harm. The Critique of Pure Reason is a warning that science could lead us in this direction. Kant assumes the danger of a materialistic view of reality that is well understood by the reader. Well, for us, we can see it in history. we can look back at the Bolshevik Revolution and see that 66 million Christians were killed. And they were killed by a materialistic government. The whole thing was a materialistic government. As a matter of fact, it wasn't a Russian conspiracy, it was a Jewish conspiracy. Jews are materialists by nature. Of the religion is a materialistic religion. Worships many gods, but I shouldn't really say materialistic religion, but something similar to that. But anyway, we can look at materialism and see where it leads just by looking at the Russian Revolution. There's no reason why you can't kill. There's no reason why you can't have sex in the middle of the street in front of a bunch of 8-year-olds. There's no reason not to do anything. And nobody really knows where this materialism, this progressivism is leading us. Logos, reason, the origins of evil. Evil flourishes when good men do nothing. The first step in solving a problem is to understand it. Evil grows in a poorly structured society, and from us having thoughts and beliefs that do not follow reason or logos. We live in a propaganda-driven state, leading us away from reason, and the propagandists are not operating in our interests, and they have no obligation to do so. A free society is run by the people. This society has gotten away from logos. It's been restructured with our unknowing consent. I'm going to outline 5 aspects of these changes. 1. Conflicts of interest. Thy silver has become dross, thy wine mixed with water. There is an ethical side of society and a material side of society. It's when we mix the two that corruption and problems start. In the above passage, the wine is the universals of God, and the water is commercial law, the law of man, based on money and material goods. Back 50 or maybe 100 years ago, a man who graduated with an education would have to make a decision as to whether to enter a private or a public life. The private life meant working for a corporation, a business, or starting a business separate from government. Private life meant the possibility of greater material well-being as compared to a public life. One's success on the private side could almost be judged by the paycheck. To work in the private side, one concedes to the material domain. This can and usually does have good purposes. The public side provided a less than ideal materialist life, but offered spiritual rewards. People like politicians, school teachers, and police officers had respect within the community and a guaranteed government income. Their minds at work would be thinking in terms of morals and ethics. Money would be largely irrelevant in their work. Their paychecks wouldn't change based on the jobs they did. This side of things kept the materialist monster at bay, as well as regulated societies with good laws, laws written to preserve freedom. Governments did their own work. A street crew fixing potholes and making streets would be directly employed by government. In Canada, we called these the Departments of Public Works. Public side, the government makes laws, and these laws are a result of ethical and moral thinking, the ought side of things. Laws, law enforcement, education, and long-term planning were the domain of government. We had a good society, a place where everyone in the world wanted to live. No man can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Matthew 6:24. We've been led into a public-private orgy, away from a society based on the separation of public and private powers. School teachers now teach the corporate agendas. Phony environmentalism is only one example. Governments provide funding for stupid ideas, known not to work, and to supposedly reduce man's footprint on the planet. Solar farms, known to be inefficient and wasteful, are created privately with public money, along with a guaranteed return on investment for private investors. Our basic right to water is being sold off to private corporations on a level few members of the public understand. Public service has now become servicing the public. Christianity has been taken out of the schools and prayer is no longer permitted. It's been a long-stated goal of the financial powers to eliminate any kind of belief in God and create a materialistic society.
Planks of the Communist Manifesto, number 27, shows their plan to destroy Christianity. Infiltrate the churches and replace revealed religion with social religion. Discredit the Bible and emphasize the need for intellectual maturity, which does not need a religious crutch.
Communism is pure materialism, eliminating universals, the ought that rulers feel encumbered by, all under the guise of making the world a gentler and kinder place. This organized atheism was created by the financial powers. The problem we face at its root can always be traced back to the mixing of public and private affairs, creating conflicts of interest. The separation of powers can be seen as necessary to prevent corruption by even the most senseless. It is a simple application of logos. But governments and corporations now promise one another money and we pay the bill. There's no reason for them not to operate this way because there's no serious objection to this on the part of the people. Public-private partnerships is more like Marxism than it is free market capitalism.
2. Theft.
Thou shalt not steal, Exodus 20:15. The Federal Reserve was created and began to lend private money at interest to governments for public use in 1913. In 1933, the United States and other Western governments became bankrupt under Chapter 11. The banks ruled and continued to lend money to governments on bonds that both sides knew could never be paid off. Private money creation for public use at interest is theft due to the false promise. And there's the mixing of the public and the private when we have private banks fund public interests. The Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can rule over actions that we take. Alan Greenspan, and that's a well-known YouTube video. Not even government has the right to steal, and this isn't government. The courts do not work for the government. They exist to prosecute lawbreakers. It is our responsibility to learn the law. No one is responsible for defending your lawful rights. The problem here is that the nature of this public-private banking theft is buried under layers of sophistry, licentiousness, and intimidation. The bar associations work for the banks, and the bar attorney is not the same thing as a lawyer. The bar association is separate from government, as it should be. This is where you get people like Dean Clifford and Robert Menard being their own lawyers because they see what attorneys are. Those are two names you should check out, I think.
The first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. Shakespeare, King Henry.
Many people have a Walt Disney view of the world and memories of TV shows about courts and lawyers that form a layer of propaganda. Fiction has no obligation to truth, but still works in planting ideas and creating perceptions. There are always financial forces shaping society. The collection of the income tax pays the interest on the loans created for wars. I don't know where people got the idea that the income tax somehow pays for the roads. You can phone the privately owned revenue collection agencies yourself and simply ask, as I did. Or you can read from the anti-income tax movement, or even from establishment proponents such as J.K. Galbraith. He wrote a book called Money, Where It Went, Whence It Came, or Whence It Came, Where It Went. The conventional view serves to protect us from the painful job of thinking, John Kenneth Galbraith. He also wrote a book called Money, and that explains banking and how the United States is in the control of a handful of men. The banks that steal from our society also funded the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia reveals their hopes, dreams, and aspirations for the rest of humanity. It was a Jewish revolution, not a Russian one. Christian churches were destroyed, and some estimated killed up to 60 million Christians. Under the media radar, the private banks have always operated in their own interests and have the money to direct government affairs towards war and an expansion of their own empire. Consent has always been manufactured in the media, War is and always has been fought for money, and this is as true now as it was 3,000 years ago, well, 2,500 years ago. War is fought for money, the Republic of Plato. Wars continue with the purpose of expanding the financial empire all over the globe so that a world government can be fully implemented. The countries that do not have private central banks and Freemasons are the ones listed as terrorist states. War is not a natural state of mankind. Prior to 1913, the world was not in a state of continuous warfare. The idea that war is fought for religion has been a permanent state of mankind is hypnotically repeated by the networks. Simple repetition is a powerful tool to reach the subconscious. It's a powerful tool for propagandists. War is fought for money, theft. No one benefits from all these wars except the banks who lend the money to pay for it all. 5 years of warfare changes society more than 50 years of peace, as explained by Carroll Quigley in his famous book, Tragedy and Hope. Spear is always pointed at both ends, and I'm not sure who said that.
3. Hypocrisy.
Only crime and the criminal, it is true, confront us with the perplexity of radical evil. But only the hypocrite is really rotten to the core, and that's Hannah Arendt. Most of the laws written for the implementation of world government are secretive, and most people are not really psychologically prepared to fully look at the changes that are taking place and that are desired to take place. Media propaganda has prevented most people from looking at all the relevant facts surrounding the implementation of world government. An excellent movie for this is The Real Face of the European Union. It shows the nature of the laws being written for the EU. The same financial powers will be creating our laws. Our money is based on a promise, so it is based on law. We have the same money system under the same banks as the Europeans, and it was a real victory for Britain to get out of the EU. What is popularly known as the Judeo-Christian ethic is really a Christian society led by Jews. Jews and Christians don't share any common ethic. Zionism is the force that fills the mainstream news channels. Bolshevism is the force that is underlying the destruction of Christianity in Western white culture. The destruction of Logos itself, reason, and the formation of a Bolshevik world government. We now subject reason to politics and political correctness. Both Zionism and Bolshevism are manifestations of Jewish supremacism, a central theme in Judaism. I believe that framing problems within the context of race is fundamentally wrong. Both the Christian and Muslim faith acknowledge this fundamental truth. Racism creates ground for conflict and is a tool for powers that be that wish to divide and conquer people. It is easy to foment in a multicultural environment. Human beings by their nature like to stick with people like them. Birds of a feather stick together. This does not mean that other races view other races as inferior. Hockey players play with other hockey players, and football players play with other football players. Each think they have a better sport. This is a natural herding instinct of men and has practical value. It preserves rather than destroys culture, and we could all learn from one another. Suppose a black man, a Chinese man, and a white man all sit down to play a board game. Suppose they agree to be nice to one another, above all else, but each plays the game by the rules of their own countries or religions. Conflict will develop. The niceties are just a lid on a pressure cooker, unless two players agree to bend to the will of a third. Nice does not make you safe from oppression, lies, or conflict. Conflicts develop due to conflicts in universals and due to misunderstandings. Multiculturalism mixes people that have different universals. The press and networks create misunderstandings through lies and omission. It's a pressure cooker. Many countries keep foreigners segregated from their populations. Foreigners have different ideas with regard to right and wrong than their own populations. To preserve their own universals and to prevent conflict, foreigners are either not permitted to stay or are segregated. Our body politic is smart enough to know this. Multiculturalism imposed on the West is nothing more than the deliberate destruction of our Christian universals and the destruction of Western society and its religion, Logos, the light of reason and the Holy Ghost conscience. An ethnocentric group, Jews, are the driving force behind multiculturalism for everyone else. Any ethnocentric group will logically have a different standard for themselves than they do for everyone else. Even the most twisted, upside down, and warped minds must ring a bell for them somewhere, somehow. It is relevant that both Christians and Muslims welcome all people of all races into their religion. It is relevant that Judaism is largely a closed racial as well as religious group that has maintained an identity throughout history. They control banking, government, and the media, and the food. Coming back to your question of the clash between the secular post-question of Europe and the new immigration wave, which is essentially religious, this is exactly what is happening. There is a clash of civilizations, and we, the Jews, are in the middle of this clash of civilizations. Rabbi Pinchas Goldschmidt, and the YouTube video is The Ultimate Guide to the Jewish Agenda of Immigration and Multiculturalism, same sources above. My concern is doing away with whiteness. Whiteness is a form of racial oppression, sure. The suggestion is that it is somehow possible to separate whiteness from oppression, and it is not. There can be no white race without the phenomenon of white supremacy. You abolish slavery and you abolish slave owners. In the same way, if you do away with oppression, you do away with whiteness. And the task is going to bring this minority together in such a way that it makes it impossible for the legacy of whiteness to continue to reproduce itself. Noel Ignatieff, University Professor of Massachusetts School of Art. Again, the YouTube video is The Ultimate Guide to the Jewish Agenda of Immigration and Multiculturalism on YouTube. 15 quotes on that baby. Check that video out for yourself and listen to the other 14 quotes. Note the incredible jaw-dropping double standard. This is known as chutzpah. Imagine what would happen if someone said this about Jews. They would likely be thrown in prison. Their chance of a fair trial, where fact is no longer a defense, would be the same as that of finding an ice cube in hell. Genocide, the deliberate and systematic destruction of racial, political, or cultural group. Merriam-Webster. An ethnocentric group pushing multiculturalism on everyone else while keeping themselves segregated is hypocrisy. It would still be hypocrisy if blacks or Chinese did it. It's not racism to say this, and it's more moronic to call it racism. Never mind that Jews played a major role in black slavery, as did blacks themselves. Blacks were collected and sold by blacks. Perhaps the networks will find a way to blame white Christians for the open white slavery that is now practiced in Israel. Hollywood makes us conscious of a fictional version of the black slave trade and blames it on white Christians. Hollywood has no obligation to truth, but does create a consciousness. This modern human slave trade is never linked to Israel, nor the old one to Jews. Everything wrong with the world is the fault of white Christianity. And it's subjective, based on conscience, reason, as explained in one of the Frankfurt School's seminal document, The Eclipse of Reason. The fundamental conflict is whether or not we apply conscience before we apply laws to people that are accused. Can man's laws be perfect? 4. Lies by omission. We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It should have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the lights of publicity during those years. But the world is more sophisticated and prepared to march towards a world government. The supranational sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodetermination practiced in past centuries. That's David Rockefeller from Memoirs. Perfect example of lying by omission is regarding World War II. The German Holocaust of 6 million Jews was always in the papers and always has been. It was on the front page of the Globe and Mail in Canada less than a month ago. The Russian Holocaust of 60 million Christians was rarely discussed, and most people are unaware of this Holocaust. Actually, a lot of them were tortured one at a time and for weeks at a time. and 60 million versus 6 million. You must understand, the leading Bolsheviks who took over Russia were not Russians. They hated Russians. They hated Christians. Driven by ethnic hatred, they tortured and slaughtered millions of Russians without a shred of human resource. It cannot be overstated. Bolshevism committed the greatest human slaughter of all time. The fact that most of the world is ignorant and uncaring of this enormous crime is proof that the global media is in the hands of its perpetrators. Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This way a reality was created that left people completely unconscious of Bolshevism. The enemy became Hitler's National Socialism rather than the bankers' International Socialism, the Bolsheviks. The German Holocaust was a vehicle from which children were educated against war and taught to be fearful of it. The Bolsheviks would lead us to a world government to end all wars. It is worthy of remark that a belief constantly inculcated during the early years of life, whilst the brain is impressible, appears to acquire almost the nature of an instinct, and the very essence of an instinct is that it is followed independently of reason. Charles Darwin, The Descent of Man. For one to realize the effect that propaganda has had on them, I think a fundamental change in belief has to occur. It can be the discovery that private interests control our money supply, which is easy to verify. It can be the realization that these wars are not being fought to protect us from threats and that these threats have been manufactured. The value of the following quote given by Donald Rumsfeld cannot be understated or underestimated, and this idea has left the consciousness of many. Vanity is the new god, and vanity makes people stupid and forget their own weaknesses. It makes them ripe for propaganda. There are things we know, things we don't know, and things we don't know that we don't know. Can be appreciated by anyone who has looked further into a belief that they held as a fact and later found to be not true. Once this happens, one comes to terms with the effect of propaganda has had on them. Many people believe themselves to be too intelligent to be fooled by propaganda. This makes them ideal victims, according to Jacques Ellul. He's a famous French sociologist, wrote a book called Propaganda. A good exercise to learn about propaganda is to watch one of the movies that challenge a reality that you accept, such as the reality of the moon landings. Everybody thinks we put a man on the moon. The movie, called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, is one that I thought was good, but there are others, giving more evidence. They do make it obvious that the moon landing, as told by the networks and the press, didn't happen. This is how powerful propaganda really is. But most people are not psychologically prepared to watch a movie like this. We tend to believe the things that happen within our own experience and that make sense according to our existing perception of the world. We have unconscious prejudices that have been implanted just with repetition. We forget that there are things that we do not even know that we don't even know. And this idea doesn't enter our consciousness. New ideas must always fit in with an already created narrative. Resistance to other conflicting ideas is called cognitive dissonance. If one refuses to look at both sides of an issue or look at it from an opponent's point of view, then mind control is preventing logical thought. Political correctness is a form of mind control. The value and importance of free speech is very well explained by John Stuart Mills in a book called Liberty. He argues against any form of political speech restriction in the pursuance of liberty and freedom. Now, free speech and freedom of expression doesn't mean, it means that in the political domain. It doesn't mean that you can just do whatever you want in public. It means that you can express political ideas freely of persecution. The peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity, as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from the opinion, still more those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great as a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by the collision with error. John Stuart Mills, The book is called On Liberty. We are ruled by propaganda. Knowledge of just how powerful propaganda is the first step in awakening. It's not an easy step for anyone. It's impossible for the vain.
5. Interdependence. Some even believe we, the Rockefeller family, are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it. David Rockefeller, from Memoirs.
This is an inversion of the part of the reality that made the United States the country where everyone wanted to live, and the same with the other Western countries. We can demand goods made in our own countries by buying them. Many foreign-made goods are made by political prisoners, slavery, and child labor. We do not have the right to freedom when we make others our slaves. The best way to eliminate slavery is to not support it, even if it means paying a bit extra for a pair of shoes. 6. Logos and reason. The first step in solving any problem is to understand it. A clear understanding of a problem often leads to the solution. Already, long ago, from when we sold our vote to no man, the people have abdicated our duties for the people who, once upon a time, handed out military command, high civil office, legions, everything, now restrains itself and anxiously hopes for just two things, bread and circuses. Juvenile, Roman poet, think about the word juvenile. People lie, but rarely do it well. Mountains of lies can be exposed with only one truth, and things are easier to disprove than they are to prove. To disprove a hypothesis, all that has to be done is to show it false in one instance. The world of logic and reason is slanted against liars, and that's unfair for a lot of people. They do not have an even or even a fair chance. They need political correctness to rebalance the scales. No longer does the West stand for truth and justice, according to Logos. There you have it. People were being used as pawns in the service of a larger messianic ideology, which was and still is essentially against practical reason, against Logos, and against all mankind. What's the solution to this madness? More subversive movements? More insurrections in places like Ferguson and Dallas? The answer to that is no. The solution is simple. People need to submit their will to practical reason and Logos. Alexander Solzhenitsyn. There is only one option, and the truth always sounds silly because it's so much simpler than most people can imagine. We vote the bums out. And we've been inoculated against that idea. We must object to what's happening and do so in a lawful way. That doesn't mean holding a sign at a street rally. That means writing a letter and putting your name on it. We write letters to show that we know what is going on. Without objection, the government is doing nothing wrong. It's a simple idea that's been forgotten. We only get the government we deserve in a free society. If we're to have a free society, we have to watch the government. But most of all, we have to penetrate the mind control and the political correctness of many and return reason to be the tool from which everybody makes judgments. Love thy Lord thy God above all else simply means to love reason above all else in Christianity. Compare the need for safety from barbarians with the desire for lower economic loads with the need for leadership. Leadership is progressive. Leadership puts us in chains. Law sets us free. Governments write and enforce law. Who ever said governments were needed to lead? Rational law is written in Kant's Metaphysics of Moral, so much more carefully considered than most of the ideas you'll find on the internet, and it is very clear and logical. It's a bad idea to come out with your own ideas and just start writing a constitution, start talking about things the way you think they should be just because you think they should be that way. There's too much of that. We have a lot of old ideas we've forgotten, and we're generating new ones that are fundamentally bad.
Now, if you're riding down a path on a horse, and let's say there's lots of wood and the path is crooked and there's lots of rocks, and all of a sudden you let go of the reins of that horse, either voluntarily or by accident, the horse is running out of control. Now, you don't stop and start wondering about, well, who owns this horse? Or could I have gotten a better horse? You try and find a way to grab the reins. Doesn't matter if UFOs exist or if there's a great big government conspiracy to cover up free energy. Now, people that are saying this really don't know anything about science, not even very basic science. I have a degree in electrical engineering. So UFOs, free energy, the Rothschilds, all that stuff's really irrelevant. What we have to do is focus on getting the reins of the horse back. And primarily how we do that is to learn about law. Now, it's nobody's responsibility to defend your lawful rights. It's your responsibility to know the law and to defend your lawful rights. If you hire an attorney, then you're giving up lawful rights. You concede to be a debtor for this international debt that I explained how lawfully it doesn't really exist. It only exists in the imaginations of the politicians and attorneys and bankers. But when we hire an attorney, we concede that debt exists. And there's been free men talking about this. There's a giant free men movement. And a lot of the stuff they say is wrong, but a lot of the stuff they say is right. And the stuff that they say is right makes sense. There are lots of things we can do. One, we can start buying domestically made goods. If you think that you deserve to live in the comfort of Western society, and you deserve the privilege of buying goods that are made by slave labor, buying from children that are making 25 cents an hour under forced labor conditions. Your thinking is severely corrupted and rotten. We have to start operating lawfully and doing lawful things and not be hypocrites. 2, we can start using cash. When the banks have your money, the banks own your money legally. They give it back to you voluntarily. Now, we've seen the banks go in Greece and take people's money without their permission. So actually carrying cash is more convenient, it's faster, and when you're in line in, say, a grocery store and you're using electronic money, it just delays everybody else. It's faster just to pull out $50 or $60 or whatever you're paying for groceries at that time. 3, recognize that the universities, the networks, and the press have all been corrupted. And this whole global warming scam is prima facie evidence for that. In case you don't know it, this whole global warming was created as a lie, and it's all explained in a document called the Report from Iron Mountain. It explains the motivations behind creating the environmental movement. 4, you can read the report from Iron Mountain and you can watch the real face of the European Union to find out where we're going with this world government. These guys are writing 200 laws a day, 300 laws a day. They're reading them off every minute. Nobody's reading the legislation. And the legislation is being written in a deep, dark place that nobody knows anything about. 6, start learning history from alternative sources rather than the corporate government and university sources. Everything they have told you has pretty much been lies by omission. The alternative history is a lot more interesting and makes a lot more sense. 6, it doesn't matter who runs society, the Jews, the Jesuits, the banks, or the free markets. If we are to have a free society, we must return to rule. And we can do that lawfully. And the problem here is that a lot of people don't know anything at all about the law. 7, learn about the law. Although much of what has been said in the free man movement has been wrong, much of it has been right. And these guys are trying to shovel through something that's essentially covered up in sophistry, licentiousness, and intimidation. And it is very difficult. I've read a lot on it. And it is very confusing, and there's a lot of people working on this. Now, the networks have done hit pieces against people like Dean Clifford and Robert Menard. That's the networks. Of course they're going to do that. They're owned by the same people that are printing the money.
So you have to really do your own research, get into the free man movement. Robert Menard did a great movie called Bursting Bubbles of Government Deception. Dean Clifford's on there explaining stuff that he's learning about trusts. And you can get the books on trusts and read them yourself, which I have, and I've read through a lot of them. 8. Learn about monetary reform and support monetary reform candidates. It's not too late and we haven't lost. If we're going to win, we're going to get monetary reform. If we're not going to win, we're not going to get monetary reform. The whole thing hinges on monetary reform. Now, to lawfully object to something that the government is doing, you have to write a letter. You can't stand on the street with a sign because your name's not attached to it. There's no responsibility associated with what you're saying. Lawfully, if you're going to say something, then there has to be a certain amount of responsibility behind what you're saying. They have to know who's saying it. So you have to write a letter and you have to sign your name. Now, personally, I don't do this because I'm dealing with Revenue Canada and I choose not to be represented. So I can't protest, but believe me, I've written letters to Revenue Canada. And that's been my way because I am trying to go a little bit deeper into this. But if you object to something, you have to state your objections. If somebody comes and starts digging up your front lawn and you're sitting on the front lawn watching them and you don't object and they're just digging up your front lawn, then they're not doing anything wrong without your objection. Now, these representatives are there to serve two masters. They're there to serve you and they're there to serve the banks. But you and me and we have been silent. So consequently, the politician's job has been a lot easier, just to vote yes for everything. Now, a lot of these guys that go into politics and become MPs and stuff, I don't think they really know shit from toothpaste when it comes down to what the intentions are of all this legislation and the direction that it's going. And even if they did, they can't do anything about it because they're not receiving the objections that they need to receive from us. So because we're not objecting is why we're being led into this New World Order. Nobody wants this. There's probably 100 people on the whole planet that will benefit from all this. The rest of us will not benefit, but we are not objecting. So it is going in this direction. And the people in power know what's going on, but they can't object without the political backing. They need the political backing in order to have the power. There's lots of people within this establishment that really don't know don't like what's going on. But without the political backing and the political will, nothing can happen. Everything hinges on political will. We have to learn about the law, learn how to object lawfully, and most importantly, really learn about monetary reform. If we get monetary reform, we will go back to sanity. If we don't go back to monetary reform, we will continue to go down this progressive world of, it's an inverted, perverted, twisted, backwards, upside down world that's really based on insanity. And that's really what they're trying to do. They're warping people's minds, warping their thinking, and people can really no longer apply reason to political situations. Another thing that they do is to prevent people from talking about politics. Somehow people are self-censoring and not talking about politics. Talking about politics is a really normal conversation between people. People shouldn't really self-censor about talking about politics, and they shouldn't really censor other people's opinions. People often get criticized and in many cases persecuted for their political views. This runs contrary to logos and reason. It's a very cruel and evil thing to do, to persecute somebody because of their political beliefs. And I know it happens to me. I work as a temp and I get people not wanting me back because I'm talking about politics. And it costs me a lot of money to face this political persecution. Persecution is fundamentally wrong, and political persecution is even more wrong. It interferes with free speech. And without free speech, we're going to be lost. We have to start talking about politics. And that's the end. Thank you very much. Truth sets us free.